Tonight on Nation and Nation, wrangling continues over mining in Ontario's Ring of Fire. The province's so-called corridor to prosperity lies through First Nations territory, and many want a greater say.
If it involves the land in our traditional areas, we should have involvement, especially at the Ring of Fire, which we consider our ancestral land.
And Trudeau's accord with NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh. What it could mean for Indigenous people, according to Liberal MP Jaime Batiste.
We're talking about 4 budgets that we're looking at that can advance Indigenous issues, that can advance reconciliation, that can close the gap.
The deal to prop up Trudeau poses political risks for the NDP. Here's why they agreed to it, despite those risks.
The Liberals are a big, giant machine. They're a big machine that I don't trust, and many people don't trust. But the reality is they're still in power.
Hello, I'm Brett Forrester. Welcome to Nation and Nation. A week ago, the Ontario government released a 5-year plan to position the province as a global mining power. On Tuesday, at a House committee, Ontario's Minister of Northern Development urged MPs to support it.
Leave us alone to move ahead with what we're calling the corridor to prosperity. We don't build mines in Ontario as a government. We provide the right conditions for those to proceed.
The 2 First Nations closest to the mineral-rich Ring of Fire are also speaking out. Marten Falls and Webekwe have proposed to build roads to the remote region of Northern Ontario. And joining me first is the Chief of Marten Falls, Bruce Achny-Piniscum. Hello and welcome to the show.
Hello.
So we just heard Minister Greg Rickford talk about the strategy. What do you make of the province's approach to mining in your territory?
It has to be open and transparent with the First Nations, and I think that's what we're trying to get at a more collaborative, inclusive approach with Marten Falls and Webekwe and the other area First Nations. So as that mining development in the region is wide encompassing, and it affects the land in many ways, and there's Aboriginal and treaty rights involved in when that development happens. So this is something that the government has to take a look at and really get moving on some of the initiatives that have to be undertaken before development starts. So I'm looking forward to seeing what their approach when it comes to the strategy.
In addition to the province, the federal government is also involved through its regional environmental assessment process. How do you think Ottawa has handled that?
It's something that is very new, and there was I believe a wide kind of research project when it first started on how it would actually roll out, and right now it's at the government's whim. It seems that how it's going to be undertaken is something that how they're proceeding. It's really at their whim. So what we're saying is if it involves the land in our traditional areas, we should have involvement, especially at the Ring of Fire, which we consider our ancestral land. We should be taking the lead on any government process that involves making policy and making decisions in the future.
Some of the other Treaty 9 First Nations have asked for the federal assessment to be restarted and be First Nations led. Do you support their demand, and why or why not?
Yes, I support anything that's my First Nation rather supports anything that's First Nation led on our traditional lands, and it's been done before, across the land. If we take a look at the self-government models in across the land, the government has actually partnered with First Nations to have a sort of initiative to move in that direction. So I don't see why it can't be done. But, as I say again, this is Marten Falls ancestral land. And, we'd like to take a lead on any government processes that happen on our lands. But I don't know if this is going to be the case, as it seems like it's going the status quo as the government makes the law. They make the policy, and First Nations are merely right now pawns in that scheme. So, we're asking for change for ourselves, for our communities, and for our neighboring communities. So, this is something that impacts not only Marten Falls First Nation, but our neighbors. So there should be some kind of open process.
I've been hearing similar concerns from other First Nations communities, like Attawapiskat, who is concerned about downstream impacts. They may be far away, but they're concerned about any impact to the river might flow towards their community. How do you think those concerns should be handled in the context of all this assessment?
Yeah, it really takes a good review on what occurred with the past mining acts. For example, De Beers opened up in a mining act that was that's since been amended, and they followed that piece of legislation at that time, in which my community is affected by the same river system, but there was minimal consultation done at that time. So I understand their concerns and their need for their involvement in any assessment, regional, especially this regional assessment. And those concerns are valid, as they involve our Aboriginal and Treaty rights that each of the First Nation holds.
As I mentioned off the top, roads would be a key part of this development. Can you tell me a little bit about your community's road proposal and what that would mean for the community?
Well, as you may know, this country called Canada was built on infrastructure, be it shipping lanes or train corridors or highway corridors. In order for communities to grow, we need that infrastructure. Today we're relying on a winter road system. That's transporting like 40 transports over ice, and with the growing changes in climate, we need a more sustainable transportation corridor than winter road systems that are no longer sustainable.
All right, we have to leave it there. Chief Achni-Piniscum, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
After a short break, we'll take a look at the Liberal NDP support agreement. Stay tuned. Welcome back. This week, the Liberals struck a deal with the NDP to keep Justin Trudeau in power until 2025. The pact is called a Supply in Confidence Agreement, and it would see the NDP support the Liberals on key votes like budgets. In exchange, the Liberals would deliver on NDP platform cornerstones like healthcare, taxes, and reconciliation. Jaime Batiste is the Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations. He joins me now to discuss this and more. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Mr. Batiste.
Thank you for having me.
First, how are you feeling about this new accord?
I'm feeling very proud of our Prime Minister. I think that Canadians sent us a clear message in the last election that they expected us to work together. And that's what our Prime Minister and the leader of the NDP had to do. I have to correct you a little bit in your start. Reconciliation and a lot of the pieces that you mentioned were cornerstones of our platform in 2019 and 2021. So really, we're just finding common ground with the NDP in which we can ensure that we're taking the time we need to get things right. And I want people to understand that when we're talking about up until governing until 2025, we're talking about 4 budgets that we're looking at that can advance Indigenous issues, that can advance reconciliation, that can close the gap, that can address some of the harms that have been done through colonization, and create pathways towards prosperity for Indigenous people. I'm really happy to see that we'll be able to do that over in a very stable manner over the next 4 budgets. And I'm proud of our Prime Minister, and I'm proud of our party for taking the leadership and listening to Canadians when they said they expect us to work together.
But what are some of the deliverables? In other words, what specifically has your party promised to do on the reconciliation file that wasn't already being done?
Well, like I said, these are all platform issues, but the biggest things that we've been hearing from communities is about housing. Indigenous housing is an important one. We've made historic commitments on that. One of the things that I'm terribly proud of that we've been able to advocate for in advance is Indigenous policing. Now, we have $1 billion making sure that we go forward to ensure that Indigenous communities have proper policing. Now, what having 4 budgets is going to mean for Indigenous policing, Indigenous housing, is not only are we going to be able to commit the money, we're going to be able to see those houses being built. We're going to see those policemen reach their communities. 4 years gives us the ability to have that runway to land a lot of the things that are line items in a budget right now, but actually get down to the grassroots level and to make sure that our Indigenous communities are safer, that there's better housing. There's all of the things that we need to do on reconciliation, including education, including moving forward with to TRC's calls to action in the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to justice. This means we get to see the tangible results, not just the line items on a budget.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've mentioned that we've got 4 budgets coming. Are we going to see some of these commitments reflected in this year's budget?
I can only say what the Indigenous Caucus has been advocating for a lot of these commitments. We've seen a lot of them already in the commitments, like the Indigenous policing and the Indigenous housing. We've also seen the largest settlement in Canadian history with the $40 billion for children in care and to fix the problems around that. We're going to be seeing more of that and working across the party's lines with the NDP on this. I feel this gives us the opportunity to see these big promised items into fruition that reach the grassroots. And I think that we're going to be very proud of where we are in 4 years, considering the leadership that we have in place now.
Well, the 2 Indigenous departments have put forward their submissions for this year's budget. They are seeking more than $40 billion combined. I know you indicated some of that's going to be for court settlements, but where else should some of that money be spent, assuming it is approved?
Well, I think one of the biggest pieces is when we're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we are looking at important issues, important things like education. We've introduced the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, but that's just part of it. What we really need to do is ensure that we're educating Canadians to the legacy of the residential schools, to share a balanced perspective of the history of Indigenous people in this country, and be truthful about the dark chapters that we've had in this country, and making sure that awareness is there. So these are some of the things that we're looking for. Of course, housing is the #1 priority that we're hearing from communities. Infrastructure is a big part of that as well, but also tangible benefits, tangible results on the calls to justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And we want tangible results that are going to be in the communities and felt at the grassroots level, not just at the top with the organizations.
Well, we recently marked World Water Day with a reminder that 36 long-term drinking water advisories remain in First Nations. You mentioned infrastructure. Does this deal include any new pledges to end these?
I want to be clear when we say the investments are there for water in the community, and that's why you'll notice probably in the agreement between the Liberals and the NDP there wasn't a mention of water. That's because the investments are already there. And I want to be clear with you on this, is that our government has made the investments, and that when communities who need to lift these boil water advisories come to us with a plan, we will fund them. And so that's the part. Each community is different in their capacity and what they have the ability to do. I know in my First Nations community, Eskasoni, I know the water person in our community is one of my personal friends. And it's not just about making the investments in the infrastructure to create the water plants. It's about the capacity for communities to sustain that water over the long term. And what we're making sure that we do is not make quick fixes. What we're trying to do is make sure that water in Indigenous communities is sustainable for the long term. And with the next 4 years and with the investments we've already made, we're confident that any community that wants to get a plan to us for clean waters and get off the boil water advisories, we will work with them and support them.
Okay, Mr. Batiste, we have to leave it there. Thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, thank you for having me.
We have to take another break. We'll be back shortly with more on this with the NDP's Blake Desjardins. Welcome back. At only 25 seats, the NDP is the fourth party in the House of Commons, but is now poised to make more policy gains than anyone else in opposition. That is, if the Liberals uphold their end of the bargain we discussed before the break. To offer his thoughts, my next guest is NDP MP Blake Desjardins. He is currently in Ottawa. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thanks so much. Always good to be here.
So why did your party agree to form this alliance with the federal government?
You know, that's truly the biggest question, I think, when we're thinking about this deal in many ways. But you have to think about why people get into politics in many ways, and why people do the things they do in our nation's capital. And New Democrats, in particular, are people with big hearts. You know, we're not necessarily the folks who would make devastating partisan decisions in order to benefit us. We're not that kind of party. And when we've seen the opportunity to make a true arrangement and a true improvement for literally thousands of people, and the largest expansion of our public healthcare system, something that we helped to bring in, usher in under Tommy Douglas. Under affordable housing, we were able to get Jack Layton to do some of that great work under a minority parliament. And again, here in Canadian fashion, under a minority parliament, we're able to hold the government more accountable and really demand that they do what's better and what's right before they, of course, continue on their own agenda.
You are the NDP's only MP in Alberta. How do you think your constituents will respond?
Well, I think Alberta has been poised, has been put in a really unique position over the last few years, particularly since conservatism has taken our province's provincial government. What we've seen was the slashing, cutting, and burning, and the breaking of our public healthcare system. People in Alberta, in my constituency, are really concerned about how public healthcare is actually going to be protected in Canada and whether or not they're going to have to start paying with their credit card. In order to stop that, we need to have strategic and strong investments in how our country looks at public healthcare. And this is the largest expansion of public healthcare in our generation. This is going to expand to every single person who's making less than $90,000 at the end of 2025. But this year, just 2022, at the end of this year, every child under the age of 12 will be able to get dental care. This is an unbelievable success for our country. Majority of people who come into children's hospitals, we spoke to a children's hospital in Toronto just yesterday. They said the number one issue children come into the hospital for surgery is actually lapsed dental care. They can't afford dental care, these children. They get an abscess, it gets an infection, they're scared it might get to their brain, so they do the performative dental work for free at cost because it becomes a medical emergency. This is going to stop that from happening, and eventually it's going to make sure that every single person who makes less than $90,000 has dental care.
Well, reconciliation is also a big part of this deal. What impact do you think it'll have on Indigenous communities?
Well, this is one of the parts, being an Indigenous person, we fought hard for, because it's unfortunate that we weren't able to get enough. I can recognize that. I recognize Indigenous people. We have such significant issues with the country, and there's such long-standing grievances, from things like boil water advisories to making sure employment equity is there for Indigenous people and making sure there's investment. The government wasn't willing in many ways to meet Indigenous people, or isn't willing to meet Indigenous people on these things, but we're encouraged that without the inclusion of this within our current deal, we're going to still push for them. We're not going to give up on those things. If it was a new Democratic government, we would definitely implement many, many more reconciliation items. But this is a Liberal minority government, and we're 25 members of 338 House. And this is a significant deal for reconciliation that 25 members can get. One of the largest housing investments in Indigenous communities than we've ever seen. But the unique part about this Indigenous funding is not going to be controlled by the government. The government can't stipulate what the uses of this funding are. And in fact, over the course of history of on-reserve and on-Métis settlement housing has been these asset dumps. And everyone who's worked in the band office and everyone who's worked in administration offices knows this. When we build infrastructure in communities, the government often never supplies operation and maintenance fees, which creates the assets having such short lifetimes, resulting in mold earlier, deconstruction of these houses earlier, and they're far worse. So the unique part of this program is Indigenous nations can actually tailor these programs specific to how they want to operate housing, including the work of operations and maintenance, so that these houses don't lapse, they don't get molding, they don't break down over time. They have a longer life cycle.
You mentioned dental care now and Indigenous housing. What else needs to be in place by 2025 for the NDP to consider this pact a success?
Well, one of the biggest and most significant things and issues of our time, I think, for Indigenous people is missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit folks. We're seeing an unprecedented attack on Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people across the country, and this has been going on for decades and decades, and it's been unaddressed. You know, it's flies right in the face of reconciliation when women, Indigenous people can't have safety for their own wherever they are, whether it's on a highway or they're trying to walk someplace like the Highways of Tears, where we're seeing still a gross level of violence against women there, or whether it's domestic cases. And so we have to look at how we get true outcomes for that. So we ask the government, first of all, why is it going so slow right now? Why are they not implementing the calls to action that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous and Two-Spirit Girls report demands? And we want to see a framework that creates accountability and timelines, but also we want to see a pathway to ensure that the provinces and territories are also accountable. It's one thing for the federal government to do these things, but we need a partner provincially. We need to have partners municipally, and we need them to know that this is an urgent national issue that we need to address as part of our pact, or we won't continue to support it.
Politically, there are some risks involved in this deal as well. In your opinion, how do the risks involved for the NDP as the smaller parties stack up against the potential benefits that you've just outlined?
You know, historically, minority parliaments have often, well, not often, but in times of great crisis like we're experiencing right now in our country, great instability, great crisis like affordability to the war in Ukraine, things are tough. And so we know that in this minority setting, we're willing to take a political risk to ensure that Canadians have security, that they have the programs that they need, and they have the largest expansion of our public healthcare system and public social safety net than they've ever had. This is what we need to do in an emergency. This is what we need to do in a crisis. It's critical to that fact. And so that's my priority beyond political risk. My priority is to get results for Canadians. That's why I got into this. But to speak more directly to your question, yes, of course, you know, the Liberals are a big, giant machine. They're a big machine that I don't trust and many people don't trust. But the reality is they're still in power, and we need to do what we can in order to get what's right for Canadians.
All right. NDP MP Blake Desjardins, appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much.
And that's all we have for you tonight. Remember to check out our podcasts or find us online. Go to aptnnews.ca/nation to nation for that. I'm Brett Forster, and thanks for watching.